Victoria Lang had rebuilt her husband's shipping empire from the ground up after his death 3 years earlier, turning grief into 18-hour workdays because it was easier than sitting still. Everyone told her time would soften the edges of losing him. It hadn't. She still wore his wedding ring on a chain around her neck, tucked beneath her blouse where no one in the boardroom could see it. That afternoon, her driver dropped her outside a small community center near the harbor, where her foundation was funding a renovated playground for military families. She rarely attended these events in person, but something about this one had pulled at her, and she hadn't been able to say no. Children ran across freshly poured concrete. Volunteers hammered the last boards into a wooden climbing structure. And near the fence line, a man in a faded gray t-shirt knelt beside a little girl, tying her shoelace with the patient care of someone who'd done it 10,000 times before. His daughter, maybe 6, chattered about the swings while he listened like it was the only conversation that mattered. Victoria almost looked away. Almost. Then the sunlight caught something at his collar, a thin silver chain, and hanging from it, a small anchor pendant with a nearly invisible engraving along its edge. Her breath caught in her throat. She knew that necklace. She had bought it herself from a small jeweler 2 blocks from the naval base, 6 months before her husband David shipped out on the deployment that never brought him home. She had watched the jeweler engrave the initials herself. DL, always home. It was impossible. And yet there it was, resting against a stranger's collarbone like it had always belonged there. Her hands trembled slightly as she crossed the playground, weaving between children and volunteers, her eyes locked on that small silver anchor. "Excuse me," she said, her voice tighter than she intended. "That necklace, where did you get it?" The man looked up, startled by the urgency in her tone. For a moment something unreadable passed behind his eyes, recognition maybe or caution. "Ma'am, the necklace," she repeated. I need to know where it came from." He glanced down at his daughter, who had stopped playing and was watching the exchange with quiet curiosity, then back at Victoria. "It was given to me," he said carefully, "a long time ago." "By who?" He hesitated just long enough that Victoria felt her pulse climb into her throat. "Someone I served with." The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. Victoria's mind raced through possibilities she hadn't let herself consider in 3 years. She studied his face, the sun-worn lines, the guarded calm, the way his eyes kept flicking toward his daughter as though checking she was still safe, and something in her chest twisted painfully. "What was his name?" she whispered. The man's jaw tightened. "I think we should talk somewhere quieter." They sat at a picnic table at the edge of the playground while his daughter played nearby, close enough to watch but far enough not to hear. Victoria's hands were folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone pale. "My name is Marcus Doyle," he said finally. "I served 8 years in the Navy. 4 of those years my unit worked alongside a logistics officer named David Lang." Victoria's breath left her in a shaking exhale. "That's my husband." "My late husband," Marcus nodded slowly, his expression heavy with something that looked almost like guilt. "I know, you know," her voice cracked. "You've known who I was this whole time." "I've known for 3 years," he admitted quietly. "I recognized you the moment you walked in today. I've seen your photo." David kept one in his gear, "the whole time we served together." Victoria's mind spun, grief and confusion tangling together until she could barely separate them. "Then why?" Her voice broke. "Why have you never come to me? Why do you have his necklace?" Marcus looked down at his hands for a long moment before answering. "The day of the accident, our transport hit rough water during an emergency evacuation. David got 6 of us onto the last raft before the hull breached. He didn't make it onto that raft himself." Victoria's eyes filled instantly, 3 years of carefully managed grief threatening to break loose all at once. "Before the water reached him," Marcus continued, his voice low, "he pulled this necklace off and put it in my hand. He said, 'If I don't make it, find her, don't tell her how. Just make sure she's not alone.'" He paused. "I promised him I would." The playground noise faded into the background as Victoria stared at him, tears sliding silently down her face. "3 years," she said. "You've known where I was for 3 years." "I didn't know how to walk up to you," Marcus admitted. "What was I supposed to say?" "I was there when your husband died, and he asked me to watch over you. I didn't want to be a stranger showing up in your worst memory. So I did the only other thing I could think of." Victoria wiped her eyes, confusion cutting through the grief. "What do you mean?" Marcus reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, worn notebook, its pages soft from handling. He opened it to a page filled with dates and small handwritten notes. "Every scholarship your foundation gave to a military family's kid over the past 3 years. I made sure the applications got seen." Every playground renovation, every emergency fund request that came from a spouse who'd lost someone in an accident like David's. I flagged them myself to your foundation's review board. Anonymously, he looked up at her. I couldn't bring him back to you. But I could make sure the thing he cared about most, the thing he died trying to protect, never went unnoticed. Victoria stared at him, stunned into silence. She had built her foundation in David's memory, believing every good thing that came from it was simply the result of her own hard work and good instincts. She had never known that somewhere behind the scenes, a stranger had been quietly steering her attention toward the families who needed it most. Honoring a promise made in the last seconds of a dying man's life. Why didn't you ever tell me? She finally managed. Because I didn't want you to feel indebted to me, Marcus said simply. You didn't need another person asking something of you. You needed your husband's memory to mean something. I just tried to make sure it did, quietly, without turning it into anything about me. Victoria looked past him, toward his daughter swinging happily on the newly built playground equipment. Oblivious to the conversation reshaping her father's past. Her mother passed 2 years ago, complications during a difficult pregnancy, Marcus said quietly. I raised her alone since. David's necklace has been the one thing I've never taken off. Somehow, keeping that promise to him made it easier to keep the promises I made to her too. The two of them sat in silence for a long moment. The sound of children's laughter drifting around them like something entirely separate from the weight of the conversation. I don't know what to say, Victoria finally whispered. You don't have to say anything, Marcus said. I never expected you to find out. I was content letting it stay that way. Well, Victoria said, wiping her eyes and managing the ghost of a smile, I found out anyway, over the following weeks. Victoria found herself returning to the Harbor Community Center more often than her assistant could quite explain on her calendar. She watched Marcus with his daughter, patient, steady, unassuming, and slowly began to understand what David had seen in him all those years ago. Here was a man who had spent 3 years quietly carrying someone else's grief without ever asking for recognition, simply because he'd made a promise in the last moments of a friend's life. She invited him to join her foundation's advisory board, not as a favor, but because no one understood the actual needs of military families better than a man who had spent years living inside that world in silence. He hesitated at first, uncomfortable with visibility, but eventually agreed on one condition: that his daughter never grow up thinking her father's worth was measured by any title or recognition, but by the quiet promises he kept when no one was watching. 6 months later, at the Foundation's annual gala, Victoria stood at the podium and told the story of a promise made in the final seconds before a wave took her husband from her, and how that promise had quietly shaped hundreds of lives without a single person ever knowing who was behind it. She didn't name him, she didn't need to. Marcus stood near the back of the room, his daughter's hand in his, watching with the same quiet composure Victoria had come to recognize as simply who he was. Later that evening, as the crowd thinned, Victoria found him near the exit. David chose well, she said softly. Both times, Marcus looked down at his daughter, then back at Victoria, and offered a small, tired smile. He usually did. Victoria touched the small anchor pendant now resting once again against her own collarbone, returned to her that afternoon at the picnic table, the engraving worn but legible. Always home. Walking out into the cool evening air, she finally understood something she hadn't been able to accept in 3 years of grief: that love doesn't always end when a person is gone. Sometimes it simply changes hands, carried quietly by someone willing to keep a promise long after anyone would have blamed them for letting it go. And the truest kind of loyalty never asks to be seen. It simply shows up again and again until the people who need it are no longer alone.